So this is one of the most positionally beautiful games that Magnus Carlsen ever played, and it's one of my favourites, especially because it was played against none other than Vladimir Kramnik, former world champion. This is Norway 2016. Now watch how these knights just dance around the board. Real elegance. So Carlsen kicks off with a Queen's Gambit here. We get the knights developing, and now he goes for the exchange variation, and this is now a Carlsbad pawn structure once these pawns develop to c6 and e3. Now by starting with this e3 move and not queen to c2, which is a possible alternative line for white, you allow black to go bishop f5, which is what Kramnik plays in this game. Other moves there include bishop e7, more common, or knight b to d7. Now when black goes for this one, you don't want to go bishop d3, at least not at the elite level, because then black equalizes straight away basically. So the white players, they go for this queen f3, looks a bit weird developing it so early, but here's the idea. The bishop drops back and then you shatter the pawn structure. Now you want to recapture with the queen so that you can get the queens off the board, so at least when you've got the shattered structure, white's not got the queen attacking the black king. So why would white do this? Give up the bishop pair because black's now got that pair, which is good in the long term. Well, the whole point is that you've shattered these pawns, and now watch how these white knights fight for this f5 square. Really instructive. So knight f3 is started with by Carlsen. We get knight d7 from Kramnik, and now knight h4 immediately played, but not with the idea of taking the bishop, restoring that bishop pair in balance, because then black simply retakes, repairs the structure, and white's just got no advantage to speak of. There is a small one here for white. So bishop e7 played, and now this was a new move at the time played by Magnus Carlsen, and apparently it was his long-term second, John Ludwig Hammer, that came up with this idea. So knight e2 played. Really logical looking move, coming around to g3 and f5. Although before this one was played, more often players had been playing g3 to support this knight. So Kramnik, he now plays this knight into b6, and very commonly we see this one maneuvering to c8 and then into d6, where it looks at this critical f5 square, prepares to exchange pieces. However, not in this game. So knight g3 played by Magnus, aiming for that key square. Now Kramnik flicks in this bishop b4 check. The knight left c3 with that maneuver. Kramnik says, okay, I'm going to punish you for that. I'm going to ruin the position of your king. It slides to d1. And now this is where Kramnik just makes a micro mistake and then compounds it. So the top move here is to remaneuver the knight and then into d6. And, look at these squares as mentioned, especially f5. But he goes knight to a4, pressuring this pawn, drumming up some counterplay. He's got lots of pieces looking in this direction, but he's missed an idea for Magnus. So he was probably expecting something like king c1. Defend that pawn, but now black can follow up with bishop e1. And if f3, well, you can chop off one of those dangerous knights, and all the kind of squeeze that white wants to get in the end game has been dissipated. So running it back here, king c1 perhaps expected, but not played. You don't want to go b3, you weaken c3 way too much. So what does Magnus do? Well, he immediately jumps his knight into f5, ignoring the fact that the pawn is on prise. But here's the trick. If you capture that pawn with check, then the king simply slides into c2, and this knight's getting a bit embarrassed. Once this knight hit f5, it blunted this bishop's influence, and this is why the whole variation's possible. Now, if you retreat to a4, then there's king b3. Weird kind of tactic in the middle game here, but with the queens off the board, you can go for this one. You hit two pieces, and although black can do this one, counter-attack on the rook, after rook c1, threatening to pick up two minors for the rook, there's nothing black can do. b5 is best, and then you pick up the two pieces, and if you don't go b5, if you try bishop b2, then there's rook c2, and again you're going to pick up a piece. This is even worse. So running it back here, if we go back on the variation, if the knight takes on b2, king c2, well, retreating to a4, no good. King b3, winning a piece, or 2 minors for the exchange. What if you try knight c4? Again, no good. We chop, pawn recaptures, and you now bring a rook to the b file, hitting this one, and then preparing to take here. And you bring this rook, by the way, so that the a file rook stays here, preparing a3. This is how the line could go. Bang, the rook invades. This is just really good for white. So running it back, knight takes on b2 with check, not possible. So what does Kramnik do instead? Well, king d7 connects his rooks, and now rook b1 from Magnus just covers that pawn, and Kramnik is in a real bind. Now what should he do? Well, retreat the knight meekly, admit the mistake, tail between his legs, and just come back, look to remaneuver into here, go for that kind of plan once again. But instead, he goes king e6, pressures the knight on f5, the bishop covers, and now he brings a rook to the c file, preparing c5 and queenside play. But it isn't leading anywhere particularly fruitful, and watch how Magnus now squeezes. So he starts with king e2, connecting his rooks, and now bishop f8 was played, preparing c5. Basically, if you played c5 before dropping the bishop back, you were running into some troublesome stuff with a3, forcing the bishop in the wrong direction. So we have g4 now played, really cementing the outpost. I mean, look at that light squared domination. Now we get pawn c5 from Kramnik. This knight remaneuvers to g2. It's heading for f4, where it's going to pressure all of these sensitive points in the black position. So takes was played. You can take back with the knight with check. Still a miserable pawn structure for black. But Magnus takes with this one. Still a great move. Keeping this knight cemented here. We get bishop d6, stopping this knight from hopping to f4. And now Magnus pushes this pawn, squeezing with those pawns now. And black is really feeling that compromised pawn structure. Big threat to go pawn h5, force the bishop to capture. This one recaptures, and then you'd be skewering the king to the rook, or you'd be winning this pawn here, that kind of thing. So the computer's top move here is rook h8, come off the skewer, defend this pawn, but say a position like this, check, king goes, h6, lock down this weakness. I mean, how miserable is this? This rook tied down, babysitting, hugely passed pawn if this one ever drops. So Kramnik, instead of going for the passive rook h8, he lashes out with pawn h5, trying to deal with that weakness in this manner. Now it does allow Magnus to check, the king drops and simply win a pawn, but okay, they're doubled pawns at least. This would have been Kramnik's thinking. The bishops drop off, king recaptures played, and the king back to d7. But there's no two ways about it. Magnus is now a pawn up, as well as still having this huge positional grip due to these amazing knights, and this one just stranded offside. So knight e3 now played, hits d5. This one finally retreats to defend the pawn. We get knight g4, pressuring f6, and this is a fascinating moment because you can go bishop e7, cover the pawn. However, instead, Kramnik goes rook to h8, brings the rook in front of those dangerous passed pawns. But Magnus, he doesn't even take. He'd rather sit on the position, bind it, make his opponent sweat like a boa constrictor. Now, if you take immediately, well, king e7 is possible. So what he does instead is bring this rook to the e file, cutting the king, and now bishop e7 is played to block the attack, but knight f5 back, pressuring that piece, bishop d8, how miserable, and we can see why the pawn wasn't captured. Pawn h6 now from Magnus, that pawn an absolute thorn in the black side, tying down the rook. Now we get rook to c8, challenging that open file, and pawn b3, more restriction of the black pieces, rook c6 played, and now this knight retreats into e3. Maybe it's going to take this pawn if this one ever moves. Is it coming to f5 if this one ever moves? Just a beautiful bind on the position. Bishop c7 played. This rook challenges the open file. We get an exchange. Rook recaptures. bishop f4, and now rook to c5, intensifying the pressure on that d5 pawn. We get the king now marching to e6. This one comes to g7 with check. King d6 back, and now knight g4, again attacking f6, and you'd love to pick up this pawn as the black player, get rid of one of those pawns, activate your rook, but the problem is knight f5 check, simply winning the rook at the end of the line, no good. So it's this mixture of tactics as well as positional bind, just a masterclass. So knight d7 played, hits that rook, it drops back to c2, and now Kramnik, utterly fed up with his position, this knife on f5 just killing him, he jettisons a pawn, at least giving this knight a square, trying to drum up some kind of counterplay. Magnus takes with check, king e6, but the knight back with check, and the king meekly returns. Rook e2 takes a new open file, and now Magnus, he's got these ideas of invading with the rook. Still, this pawn's immune. You've got the knight f5 check stuff. So that's why Kramnik goes king c6, gets out of those tactics, but bang, rook e8, just in time. You still can't take this pawn. I mean, if you go with the rook, well, fine, but you've just ditched an exchange. No good. This is just completely winning. And if coming back here, instead of taking with the rook, you take with the bishop, well, okay, you're simply losing a rook. All awful. So Kramnik takes here, knight recaptures, but now this pawn is running. So knight f8 forced, you've got to stop it. But now knight e5 check, threatening to win the pawn on f7 at the end of the line. So I say the line, I mean in the next move. So bishop captures, pawn captures, now king d7, hits this knight, we get knight f6 check, king e6, and now Magnus doesn't even yet push this pawn. He doesn't want to allow this knight g6, covering the square, so he goes h5, covers knight g6, prepares pawn h7, and after king takes on e5, will now pick your poison. You can either push the pawn straight away, or you can do this one like Magnus did. You check, you give a knight, but you've decoyed it away from this key square. The pawn's going through. We had check, king e2, and resignation from Big Vlad, because that's about to make a queen over here. That will decide the game. And so Magnus, he took this game in Norway 2016. Real masterpiece. I hope you enjoyed. To check out another epic game of chess, do see the video on screen, and thanks very much for watching. See you soon.